Hello and welcome. In the DAZ forums, I am known as Bohemian3. I like to share my interest and passion for making realistic clothing using Marvelous Designer. In this video, I want to talk about creating realistic pleats that will also simulate well. Of course, there is an excellent pleats tool in Marvelous Designer and can get you started. For myself, I like total control over the folding and shaping of the pleats, so I create them manually. In this video, we'll look at using layers, collision thickness, and sewing fold angles to get complete control over your pleats and ruffs. Before we begin creating our pleats, let's just make sure our sloper garment is set up correctly. If you noticed, I've created a number of darts to create the proper shape. If what you're looking for is realistic garments, two things you should check. Check your strain map. Make sure your garment is fitting really well. This is not unusual to have a little strain along the waist, but other from that, make sure, especially in the area that you're going to be creating the pleat in, there is no strain. Otherwise, when you go to simulate, there will be all different sorts of problems. The other thing you want to do is make sure all your steam is off, with a minor exception. If we look at our steam, this should always be the last step on designing your pattern. You should not use steam this early in the pattern making process, except maybe to flatten out your darts. That's really the only place you should use it this early in the process, which is what you would be doing if you were creating a real garment as well. So we're going to create a simple pleat so that as we make this skirt longer, it will give the person wearing it a little more room to move their legs. So I'm going to go ahead and offset as a pattern outline 4 inches to start with. And I'm going to create an internal line. We'll use this to begin shaping our pleat. In general, I don't do a lot of drastic changes in the pattern. I tend to do them in small increments, again, to make sure that when you begin to simulate, everything is working the way you want. Though for this one, I think I can do a little more than 4 inches. Let's just drag it down just a little farther. There we go. That's good to start. Now I'm going to create a pleat here. And how I do this is I actually build the pleat away from the skirt and then add it back in. So I'm going to create a rectangle that's 2 inches wide and 1 inch high for now. And what that means is there's going to be a pleat going 1 inch on each side from this slit in the skirt. And then what I'm going to do is split the line, a uniform split, and then I'll add a guideline for me to use. I'm going to create one side of the pleat that's 1 inch wide and 4 inches long. This is going to be the back of the pleat. So what I'm going to do now is build out the pleat. So I'm going to offset as a pattern outline 1 inch, and I'm going to cut and sew this. And this is the first part. So this is the back part of the pleat. I'm going to detach my sewing window and do some free sewing here. I'm going to sew this to this, and this is where the pleat begins. This is going to be sewn the opposite direction because it's going to fold over. If we move these into place, what I'm going to do is freeze this because I'm going to eventually get rid of it. That's the top of the dress. And I'm going to set up some layers here. So this layer represents the top of the dress. So that's going to be layer -1. So a pleat really has 3 parts. One is the back of the pleat. So a pleat really has 3 layers. If this is the skirt, this is going to be the layer that is on top with the skirt. This is going to be the layer underneath, and this is going to be the back. And I'm sure that doesn't make any sense until you see it simulate. So we're going to do free sewing, and this is going to match up to this. So this is -1, -2, and -3. This layer here, I'm only going to do a collision of 1, which will bring the pleats together. So here is how a pleat is created. This represents the skirt that it's going to be sewn into. This is the back part of the pleat. This is the segment that connects the front to the back pleat, and this is the front of the pleat. And so this is -3. On top of that is -2, and these are -1. This is actually the skirt itself, and this is -1. This is the skirt itself. And what's nice about this is if you decide you want the inner pleat to have a different color, you can actually set up a separate fabric which will become a material zone in DAZ. So I'm going to change this to a different color so you can see how this works. And I'm going to assign that to this inner pleat. To make these lay absolutely flat, one of the things I do is with this internal pleat, I change the collision thickness to 1. And then what we're going to do is we're going to manually set our fold angles, because this fold angle needs to be set to 360. So you see how that brings that together. And the same with this one right here. This is going to be the opposite. If we go into the fold strength or the fold angle, we're going to change that to 0. So as you can see, this little section here will go away when we sew it into the skirt. But as you can see, we're getting an absolutely flat pleat. And then these are the two pieces that we're going to sew into the skirt. These are being used just to set it up. Then what I can do is I can copy and do a symmetric pattern with sewing. So you can see the pleat is going to lay very flat. And the last thing I need to do is I just need to sew these two segments together. And so this pleat now is ready to be sewn into the skirt. Last thing I'm going to do is just line up all these pattern pieces. So now this represents the skirt, and I'm not going to be sewing that into the skirt. Only these internal pieces. So now I'm going to take these pieces, and before I put it into the skirt, I'm going to do my sewing. So remember, this piece right here represents the internal pleat. So I've got to, in this case, what looks like reverse the sewing, but if you look at it in the viewport, it's correct. And then I've got to I'll move it into place and simulate to make sure it's doing what it's supposed to do. Then what I've got to do is this line is 7.8. I've got to make these lines 7.8. And then I can sew these segments in. Again, I want to stress that I know there's a pleats tool in Marvelous Designer, and I know for many people it works very well, but for me personally, this is what I have done to get complete control over getting the pleats to lay the way I want them to lay. And additionally, having these multiple layers ensures when I go to simulate, the pleats will fall exactly the way I want them to. The Elizabethan ruff uses the same concept. In this situation, what I did is created an upper, side, and lower pattern segment so that I can sew it along and be very specific about how I want it to fold on the garment. So it has the top, the side, bottom, and then the side going back up. I copy and paste that, and then we're going to move it a little into place. It doesn't have to be exact. Then we'll do the sewing. First off, I'm going to join it to the rest of the ruff, and then I'm going to add the particular segments. Then I'm going to sew the segments to each other. So first off, my sewing ended here with the bottom ruff leading back up to the top. So now I have to sew the top, the side going down, the bottom portion, and then going back up to complete the loop. And then I simulate. So when I simulate, I see that these pattern pieces need to match up. So I do need to delete this final piece and sew these two segments together to complete the ruff. So I'm going to turn off my internal lines and my sewing. And there you can see that the ruff is following up and down based on the pattern that we did here. Last step is I'm going to match up all these individual pattern pieces so that if you're using a lace or anything with a pattern, it will nicely match up. So that is some insight on how I created ruffs in this Elizabethan garment. So these are a few techniques I use when creating more complex garments. Remember, there are multiple ways to achieve the same effect, and I encourage you to explore the many different options in addition to these I presented. I do appreciate those likes on YouTube and in the gallery if you found this useful. Thanks so much for checking in.